When a man begins to pull away, many women immediately start searching for answers. They wonder what changed, what they did wrong, and what they can do to bring him closer again. But what happens when you stop chasing those answers and simply match the distance he is creating? What happens when the attention he became comfortable receiving is suddenly no longer there? The answer can be more powerful than you expect, because sometimes silence communicates what endless conversations never could. There comes a point in many relationships when something quietly shifts. It is not necessarily an argument, it is not a breakup, it is not even a serious confrontation. It is simply the moment when one person realizes that the effort between them is no longer equal. Messages become shorter, calls become less regular. The excitement that once felt natural begins to disappear, and suddenly one person realizes they are carrying almost all of the emotional responsibility for keeping the connection alive. Many women reach this point and immediately start questioning themselves. Did I do something wrong? Is he becoming less interested? Should I reach out again? Should I call first? Should I try harder? Should I fight for what we have? These questions are understandable, but sometimes they pull you into a cycle that becomes harder to escape. The more effort you give, the easier it can become for the other person to give less. The more available you remain, the less noticeable your absence becomes. And this is where the story becomes interesting, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop trying to convince someone to notice your value. Stay with me, because what happens next is something many people only understand after they have already exhausted themselves. There was once a woman named Hannah who had always been deeply caring. She was the kind of person who remembered important dates, checked on someone when they were having a difficult day, and stayed present when others might have walked away. She believed that love meant showing up. She believed that if someone mattered to you, you made an effort. And when Hannah met Michael, she thought she had finally found someone who understood that same kind of connection. In the beginning, everything felt easy. Michael called regularly, he made plans, he asked questions, and genuinely seemed interested in her life. He made her feel noticed, appreciated, and important. His messages could instantly brighten her day. Their conversations seemed effortless, and every interaction gave her another reason to believe that something meaningful was growing between them. Like so many relationships, the beginning carried a special kind of excitement. There was anticipation. There was curiosity. There was energy. Hannah did not have to wonder whether Michael wanted to talk to her because he made his interest obvious. But then, gradually, something changed. It did not happen in one dramatic moment. There was no announcement, no clear explanation. The shift was subtle enough that Hannah almost questioned whether she was imagining it. His calls became less common, his texts became shorter, his enthusiasm seemed quieter. Sometimes hours would pass before he responded, and sometimes an entire evening would disappear without a message from him. Hannah noticed the difference almost immediately. She told herself that perhaps he was busy, maybe work had become stressful, maybe something in his personal life was demanding his attention. She wanted to be understanding, so she gave him space. Then she gave him even more space. But instead of the connection naturally returning, Hannah slowly found herself doing nearly all the reaching out. She started conversations, she checked in, she asked how his day was going. She kept the communication alive, and every time she sensed him moving farther away, she responded by moving closer. This is where many caring people unknowingly lose themselves. When they feel someone slipping away, their instinct is often to increase their effort. They send another message. They become more available. They explain themselves more carefully. They try to be more understanding. They tell themselves that if they can just love a little harder, communicate a little better, or become a little more patient, the other person will eventually return to the way they were before. Hannah was doing exactly that. She was not trying to manipulate Michael. She was not playing games. She was simply afraid of losing something that had once felt important. So she kept reaching. She kept giving. She kept hoping. But every new attempt seemed to make the imbalance more obvious. The relationship was becoming something she had to constantly maintain instead of something two people were naturally building together. Then one evening, Hannah sat alone in her apartment and looked at her phone. Earlier that morning, she had sent Michael a thoughtful message. Nothing demanding, nothing dramatic, just a simple message showing that she cared and wanted to know how he was doing. 12 hours had passed and there was still no response. She checked her phone again, nothing. She placed it down. A few minutes later, she picked it up again. Still nothing. Her mind began creating explanations. Maybe he had forgotten. Maybe he was busy. Maybe he was talking to someone else. Maybe she should send another message just to make sure everything was okay. That familiar urge began rising inside her, the urge to fix the silence, the urge to close the distance, the urge to make something happen. But then something inside Hannah finally became tired, not angry, not bitter, just tired of carrying something that was supposed to be carried by two people. And that night, Hannah made a decision that seemed incredibly small but changed everything. She did not send another message. She did not call. She did not ask why he had disappeared. She did not create a dramatic goodbye or try to make him jealous. She simply stopped overextending herself. She matched the level of effort she was receiving. If he reached out, she responded naturally. If he did not, she continued living her own life. At first, this felt uncomfortable. Hannah was so used to monitoring the connection that the silence felt almost unnatural. She wondered whether she was doing the wrong thing. She worried that Michael might think she no longer cared. She even had moments when she wanted to break the silence simply because silence was difficult to tolerate. But something else began happening. Hannah started noting how much emotional energy she had been spending on someone who was not matching it. She began going out again. She spent time with friends. She returned to hobbies she had neglected. She stopped checking her phone every few minutes. She started sleeping better. Slowly, the center of her life moved away from waiting for someone else's attention, and that shift was important because the goal was never to punish Michael. The goal was not to make him chase her. The goal was to stop abandoning herself just to keep another person close. And this is the part that many people misunderstand. Matching someone's distance is not about playing a game. It is about responding to reality instead of constantly fighting against it. When someone gives less, you do not have to compensate by giving more. Sometimes you simply step back and observe what happens when you stop doing all the work. A few days passed. Then something unexpected happened. Michael noticed. He had become accustomed to Hannah being there. He was used to seeing her name on his phone. He was used to her checking in, starting conversations, asking questions, and making sure the connection never completely disappeared. Her attention had become familiar, almost automatic, but now there was a noticeable absence. He reached for his phone one afternoon and realized that Hannah had not contacted him. At first, he thought nothing of it. Then he noticed it again the next day. And again after that, he began wondering what had changed. Was she busy? Was she upset? Had she moved on? Was she no longer interested? The silence created space for thoughts that constant attention had previously prevented him from having. And this is one of the most important things to understand. When you are always present, people can become accustomed to your presence without consciously appreciating it. When you suddenly stop filling every empty space, the other person has an opportunity to recognize what your presence was actually contributing. That does not guarantee that they will return. It does not guarantee that they will suddenly become emotionally mature. It does not mean silence can magically transform someone, but it can reveal something very valuable, whether the connection continues when you stop carrying it alone. Michael eventually sent Hannah a message. It was simple, almost casual. He asked how she had been. Hannah smiled when she saw it, but she did not rush to respond. Not because she wanted to manipulate him, but because she had finally stopped treating every message from him as an emergency. She answered when she was ready. She stayed calm. She did not punish him. She did not unload every frustration she had stored inside. She simply allowed the interaction to unfold naturally. And from that moment, Hannah began seeing the situation differently. She no longer focused only on whether Michael would come closer. She started asking a more important question: what kind of relationship was he actually willing to create? That question changed everything. Before, she had been measuring success by whether he responded. Now she measured it by consistency. Before, she celebrated every small sign of attention because she had become hungry for reassurance. Now she watched the pattern. Did he make plans? Did he follow through? Did he initiate conversations? Did his actions match his words? Was he showing genuine interest, or was he simply reacting to the possibility of losing access to her attention? Those questions gave Hannah something she had been missing for a long time: clarity. And sometimes clarity is more valuable than getting the answer you desperately wanted. Because when you stop chasing someone, you finally have enough emotional space to see them as they are. Not as the person they were in the beginning, not as the person you hope they will become, not as the person you imagine they could be if they only tried harder. You see the person standing in front of you through their actual behavior. That is the real power of stepping back. You are not trying to make someone miss you. You are giving yourself the opportunity to discover whether they notice your absence on their own. You are not trying to control their emotions. You are allowing their actions to reveal their intentions. And sometimes that truth will bring someone closer. Other times it will show you that they were never prepared to meet you with the same effort. Either way, you gain something you could never gain by endlessly chasing yourself.
Still, she could see that he had been active online.
Hannah stared at the screen, but this time she was not angry or jealous. She was simply exhausted, emotionally exhausted. And for the first time, she asked herself a completely different question. Not, why is he pulling away? But, why am I putting so much effort into keeping someone close when he keeps choosing distance? That question changed something inside her. Because sometimes real growth begins when we stop studying another person's behavior and finally start looking honestly at our own. The next morning, Hannah made a quiet decision. She was going to stop chasing. Not as a strategy, not as manipulation, not as revenge. She would simply match the level of energy she was receiving. If he texted, she would answer warmly. If he called, she would respond. But she would no longer be responsible for carrying the entire relationship by herself. At first, it felt strange, very strange. People often underestimate how difficult it is to stop a behavior that has become an emotional habit. She wanted to send him a message. She wanted to ask what was happening. She wanted reassurance that everything was still okay. But instead of reaching for him, she began reaching back toward herself. She returned to activities she had once enjoyed. She spent more time with friends, she exercised, she read. She began rebuilding the parts of her life that had slowly been pushed aside while she focused so much attention on someone else. And then, after several days, something unexpected began to happen. Michael noticed. Stay with this part, because this is where the emotional dynamic starts to change. There is something many people misunderstand about distance and attention. When a person is constantly available, their presence can slowly become something the other person expects, rather than something they consciously appreciate. Michael had become used to Hannah being there. He was accustomed to her messages, her questions, her concern, and her steady emotional presence. He did not necessarily wake up every morning deciding to take her for granted. Sometimes people simply become comfortable. Sometimes they become distracted. Sometimes they become careless. Sometimes they are uncertain about what they want. And sometimes they simply do not recognize the value of something until its constant presence is no longer guaranteed. But now Hannah was quiet. She was not disappearing to punish him. She was simply no longer filling every empty space. For the first time, Michael experienced the very distance he had been creating, and that space gave his mind room to think. He started wondering, why hasn't she texted? Is she upset? Is she losing interest? Did something change? Notice what happened here. Those were almost the exact questions Hannah had been asking herself only days earlier. The emotional mirror had turned around, and suddenly Michael found himself standing on the other side of the uncertainty. The silence was no longer something Hannah was trying to solve. It was something he now had to experience. And for Michael, that experience was uncomfortable. He checked his phone more often. He noticed that Hannah was less available. He noticed that she was no longer trying to keep every conversation alive. Most importantly, he began noticing how much emotional stability she had quietly brought into his life without demanding recognition for it. Human beings can become strangely blind to consistency. Someone checks on you every day, and eventually you expect it. Someone listens when you are struggling, and eventually you assume they will always be there. Someone supports you, remembers the small details, makes time for you, and repeatedly shows up. And because that behavior happens so often, its value can become almost invisible. But remove that consistency, and suddenly the absence becomes noticeable. It creates contrast, and contrast can reveal what familiarity was hiding. Michael started realizing that Hannah's presence had been doing more for him than he had understood. She had been offering patience, attention, warmth, and emotional steadiness. He had become so accustomed to receiving those things that he had stopped asking whether he was giving the same in return. That realization did not instantly make him a different person. It simply made him aware. And awareness is often the first step toward change. Weeks passed. Hannah continued living her life. She did not constantly check whether Michael had viewed her stories. She did not post mysterious messages hoping he would react. She did not try to make him jealous. She did not create a performance of being happy. She was simply becoming genuinely more present in her own life. Then one afternoon, Michael finally called. Not because Hannah demanded his attention. Not because she begged him to come back. Not because she chased him until he responded. He called because curiosity had slowly grown inside him. He wanted to know what had changed, and curiosity can be powerful. People often think more deeply about what they can no longer understand. They notice what no longer feels guaranteed. They become more aware of what may be slipping beyond their reach. But here is the part that matters most. When Hannah answered the phone, she was calm. She was warm. She was friendly. But she was different. She was not cold. She was not bitter. She was not trying to prove anything. She was simply centered. For the first time in months, her emotional state was not dependent on how that conversation ended. If Michael wanted to reconnect, she would listen. If he remained distant, she would still be okay, and he could feel that difference. Confidence is often noticed before it is understood. A person can sense when someone no longer needs external validation to believe they are valuable. They can sense when fear has stopped controlling the conversation. They can sense when self-respect has become stronger than the fear of losing them, and that changes the entire atmosphere. Hannah was no longer communicating, "Please choose me." Her energy was communicating, "I choose myself too." That distinction is powerful. Confidence does not mean acting superior. It does not mean pretending you do not care. It means caring without losing yourself. It means being able to love someone without making their attention the foundation of your identity. And that realization can create unexpected thoughts in the mind of someone who once felt certain that you would always be there. He may begin wondering what changed. He may wonder whether he underestimated your value. He may question whether he became too comfortable. He may even wonder whether someone else will eventually recognize what he failed to appreciate. Suddenly, the certainty he once had begins to disappear. And when certainty disappears, complacency can disappear with it. This is where attention often returns. But do not miss the deeper lesson. The purpose of matching his distance is not to make him chase you. It is not a secret trick for controlling another person's emotions. It is not about creating jealousy or making someone afraid. The real purpose is to stop abandoning yourself. Too many people approach this idea as though it is a strategy for getting another person back. But that misses the point entirely. This is about reclaiming your emotional balance. It is about remembering that your value does not increase simply because someone chooses you, and your value does not suddenly decrease because someone pulls away. Your worth existed before the relationship. Your worth exists while you are in the relationship. And your worth remains even if the relationship eventually ends. Hannah slowly began to understand that truth. And once she understood it, something inside her became peaceful. Not because Michael had suddenly transformed, not because she had guaranteed a happy ending. She felt peaceful because she had finally stopped fighting herself. She had moved from needing to choosing, from chasing to observing, from fear to self-respect. And when one person changes internally, the entire relationship dynamic can shift. Suddenly, the old pattern no longer works the same way. The person who was always reaching is no longer reaching. The person who was always waiting is now living. The person who was afraid of losing someone is beginning to realize that losing herself was the greater danger all along. What happened next would teach both Hannah and Michael something neither of them would easily forget. A few days after that phone call, Michael found himself thinking about Hannah far more than he had in months. It happened in ordinary moments, while driving home from work, while scrolling through his phone late at night, while sitting alone on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Nothing dramatic had happened. Hannah had not made some grand announcement. She had not posted cryptic messages online. She had not tried to make him jealous. She had not sent him a long emotional paragraph explaining how hurt she was. In fact, she had done almost nothing outwardly dramatic at all. And perhaps that was exactly why her absence felt so noticeable. There was no obvious reason for Michael to point to. There was simply a difference. The woman who had once been constantly reaching out was no longer doing so. The person who had always made the connection easy was no longer carrying it. And now Michael had to decide whether he wanted to step forward himself. This is the moment many people overlook. When you stop chasing, you do not just change how another person sees you. You change what you are able to see about them. You discover whether they will make an effort without being pushed. You discover whether their interest exists beyond convenience. You discover whether they want a real connection or simply enjoyed having someone always available. And whatever answer appears, it gives you something precious, clarity. So if you are watching this and wondering what to do when someone begins pulling away, remember Hannah. Do not panic. Do not immediately assume you are not enough. Do not exhaust yourself trying to earn back attention that should be freely given. Step back, breathe, watch the pattern, let action speak. And most importantly, return your attention to your own life. Because sometimes the strongest message you can send is not a message at all. It is the quiet decision to stop chasing what refuses to meet you halfway. She had not tried to make him jealous. She had not picked fights. She had not created arguments just to get a reaction. She had simply stepped back and allowed reality to show her what was actually there. And reality was beginning to speak very clearly inside Michael's mind. For the first time, he was experiencing the relationship without Hannah constantly carrying it forward. There were no regular check-ins, no thoughtful good morning messages, no emotional safety net waiting for him every day. And that absence forced him to face something uncomfortable. He had become used to receiving effort without truly noticing how much effort it required. Now, before anyone misunderstands this story, it is not about blaming men. Women can behave exactly the same way. Human beings often stop noticing the value of something when that thing becomes too familiar. We become comfortable. We assume tomorrow will look like today. We assume the person who always stays will continue staying. The lesson is much bigger than gender. But in Michael's situation, familiarity had created a kind of blindness. He had stopped truly seeing Hannah, not because she had suddenly become less valuable, but because he had quietly assumed she would always be there. And that assumption can become dangerous in any relationship. The moment we believe someone will never leave, never change, never become exhausted, or never reach a point where they choose themselves, we can begin treating their presence as guaranteed. But no person's presence should ever be treated as permanent property. And Michael was about to learn that lesson in a way he could no longer ignore. Keep listening, because the next conversation would force him to see the situation from an entirely different perspective. One evening, Michael was sitting with a longtime friend named David. They had known each other for years, so David could usually tell when something was bothering him. They talked about work, everyday problems, plans for the future, and all the ordinary things friends discuss. But after a while, David noticed that Michael seemed distracted. He looked at him and said, "You seem somewhere else tonight." Michael laughed quietly, trying to brush it off. David leaned back and watched him for a moment. Then he asked, "What happened?" Michael hesitated. He was not sure how to explain it because he had never really admitted the thought to anyone. Finally, he said, Hannah feels different lately.
David looked at him and asked, "Different how?"
Michael paused before answering. She doesn't reach out like she used to. David stayed quiet for a second and then asked a simple question. And how often do you reach out to her? That question landed much harder than Michael expected. Sometimes the simplest questions are the ones that expose the truth we have been avoiding. Michael suddenly realized that he did not have a good answer. For months, he had expected Hannah to maintain the connection. For months, she had been the one starting conversations, checking in, showing concern, and keeping the emotional connection alive. For months, he had been receiving effort that he was not consistently returning. And now that effort had disappeared, he could finally feel the difference. David looked at him carefully and said, "Maybe she's tired." Those words stayed in Michael's mind. Maybe she's tired, not angry, not dramatic, not trying to play some clever game, just tired. Tired of carrying something that was supposed to be shared. Tired of giving more than she received. Tired of hoping that things would eventually become balanced. And suddenly Michael began to understand what he had failed to notice before. Many women watching this will understand that kind of exhaustion immediately. It is not always loud. It does not usually arrive in one dramatic moment. It builds quietly, one disappointment at a time, one unanswered message, one broken promise, one cancelled plan, one moment of feeling ignored, one situation where you realize you are making excuses for someone who is not making the same effort for you. And slowly, almost invisibly, something inside you begins to change. You do not necessarily stop caring, you simply stop having the energy to keep proving that you care. You begin realizing that affection by itself cannot carry an entire relationship. Love may create the connection, but consistency, respect, communication, and mutual effort are what keep it alive. Hannah had reached that point. She had not stopped caring about Michael overnight. She had simply reached the moment where caring alone was no longer enough to make her continue doing everything. Meanwhile, Michael's thoughts were becoming stronger. The more Hannah focused on her own life, the more noticeable her absence became. And this is one of the strange paradoxes of human behavior. When you constantly chase someone, you leave very little room for that person to experience your absence. You fill every silence before they can feel it. You answer every distance by moving closer. You solve every problem before they are forced to think about it. But when you stop chasing, space appears. And inside that space, awareness can begin. Michael was now living inside that space. He had time to wonder, time to remember, time to question his own behavior, and those questions were becoming harder to ignore. Michael started thinking about the past. He remembered their first date. He remembered the long conversations that seemed to have no ending. He remembered the nights they laughed so much that neither of them could catch their breath. He remembered the moments when Hannah supported him during difficult periods. He remembered the encouragement she gave him when he doubted himself. He remembered the small things she did that he had barely noticed at the time. The memories were not new, they had always existed, but distance had changed the way he saw them.
Memories can become surprisingly clear when someone is no longer constantly present.
Sometimes we do not recognize the value of a person while we are standing in the middle of their love and attention. We become accustomed to their kindness. We assume their support will always be available. We stop asking ourselves what life would feel like without it. Then the dynamic changes, and suddenly the small things become large in our memory. A simple message becomes meaningful. A familiar voice becomes comforting. A person who once seemed ordinary becomes deeply significant because their absence creates contrast. Michael began realizing that Hannah had been contributing far more than he had consciously understood. And that realization created something else inside him, regret. Not necessarily regret because she had left, because she had not completely left. It was regret because he was beginning to understand that he had not valued what was already in front of him. That is a painful realization, and once you see it, you cannot easily unsee it. Several weeks later, Michael sent Hannah a message. This time the motivation was different. He was not simply bored. He was not looking for someone to fill an empty evening. He was not reaching out because he wanted quick attention or reassurance. He genuinely wanted to talk to her. Hannah noticed the difference immediately. Their conversation felt natural. It was easy, there was warmth between them, but something important had changed. The old imbalance was no longer controlling the interaction. Hannah did not sound like someone sitting beside the phone waiting to be chosen. She sounded like someone who had already made a decision about herself. She could enjoy the conversation without needing it to determine her worth. She could listen without immediately trying to secure the relationship. She could care without chasing. And Michael could feel that difference. This is what happens when someone begins to understand their own value. They stop negotiating for basic respect. They stop begging for consistency. They stop explaining why their feelings deserve consideration. They stop trying to convince another person to care. Instead, they watch behavior. They observe patterns. They listen to words, but they pay even more attention to actions. And then they make decisions based on what they actually see. That kind of strength is difficult to fake because it does not come from acting cold. It comes from becoming emotionally grounded. Hannah was not pretending she did not care. She simply no longer needed Michael's attention to feel important. And that difference was powerful. Michael began paying closer attention. He noticed that Hannah laughed more. He noticed that she seemed lighter. He noticed that she was enjoying her life instead of constantly waiting for him to decide what their relationship meant. He also noticed something else. Hannah was no longer trying to convince him of anything. She was not trying to prove that she was desirable. She was not constantly explaining herself. She was not asking whether he still cared every time his communication changed. She had stopped measuring her value through his behavior, and that created a completely different energy between them. Michael began to understand that the woman he had once assumed would always be available was now living from a place of choice. If she wanted to be there, she would be there. If the relationship became healthy and balanced, she could participate, but if she had to keep sacrificing her peace to maintain it, she was no longer willing to do that. And that realization made Michael think more carefully about his own actions. He started asking himself questions he had avoided before. Was he actually giving Hannah what he expected from her? Was he communicating clearly? Was he showing appreciation? Was he making an effort because he genuinely valued her, or only when he feared losing her? Those questions mattered. Because sometimes a person does not realize they have been neglecting a relationship until the other person stops compensating for that neglect. Hannah's change did not magically fix Michael. It simply removed the cushion that had allowed him to remain unaware. And that is an important distinction. You cannot force someone to become more loving. You cannot manufacture emotional maturity. You cannot make someone value you by performing a perfect strategy. What you can do is stop protecting them from the consequences of their own lack of effort. Let them experience the relationship as it actually is. Let their choices become visible. And then, instead of chasing an answer, watch what they do with the space you give them. Because sometimes the clearest answer is not what someone says when they feel you slipping away. It is what they consistently do once they realize they can no longer depend on you to carry everything.